Hi Cyber Law class, this is Professor Opterbeck and welcome to the first online asynchronous class in our semester. And this is going to be the first class of our semester, and we're going to do a little bit of discussion about the challenge of internet governance. And I'm starting off the semester talking about internet governance because when we're talking about cybercrime, and when we're talking about civil liberties in cyberspace, which is what we're going to spend this whole semester talking about and discussing, we have to have a bit of an understanding of what the history of the internet is and how the internet is governed. Because what you're going to see starting today and throughout this whole semester is that there are many ways in which the internet is a unique phenomenon as it relates to our concepts of law and governance, our modern concepts of law and governance. It is an international phenomenon. It crosses borders. You'll see later in the semester that there are efforts in many countries to prevent parts of the internet, at least, for crossing borders, and we'll talk about some of the knotty human rights and civil liberties problems that arise from that. But the phenomenon itself is really transnational. And the phenomenon itself is really something that historically was meant to govern itself from the bottom up. Now, I had you read Barlow's Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in this video and into some of the responses to that. But this notion that cyberspace is supposed to be a separate place has deep roots in the history of the internet. So these themes of it being international, of being self-governing, of being transnational, or really apart from national, raise some questions about, well, who is actually policing crime on the internet, and how is that done, and how does that relate to the concepts of civil liberties that we might have in different countries, whether it's in the US or in the EU or in China or in other countries. First, you have to have a little bit of understanding of where the internet comes from and of what we mean when we talk about internet governance. So there's a few pieces of this that we're going to talk about in this video. One is the concept of linguistic theory, or the difference between the sign and the thing that is signified. You might be familiar with this concept from courses you might have had in linguistics or in philosophy or in literature, or maybe you're not, but we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll talk about how that relates to the concept of data compression, and we'll talk about how all of this relates to the different kinds of technologies that are possible for a network, a packet switch network versus a circuit switch network. And you'll see that the notion of the internet, or the function of the internet, as a place where the sign and the signified can be disaggregated and changed, where the sign can be compressed, the data can be compressed, the data can be broken up into packets, those packets can be routed in somewhat unpredictable ways in different routes throughout the whole network, relates to the underlying principles that it ought to be a transnational and self-governing kind of thing. And we'll see how that develops into concepts of soft law. And we'll also talk a little bit about the origins of the internet as a military academic open architecture network. It was designed for the architecture, the code, the pieces that allow different computers on the internet to connect to each other, to be open for some important reasons historically, and that still is important when we think about internet governance today. So let's talk first about this concept of the difference between the sign and the signified. And now I know you're probably watching this thinking, wait, I signed up for a cyber law course. I want to talk about law. I want to talk about civil liberties. I want to talk about computer crimes. Why am I talking about linguistic philosophy? But I promise you, these basic concepts will relate throughout the semester to how we think of governance and law on the internet. So the basic idea here is that we as human beings have ways of using signs. The signs could be pictures, the signs could be images, but signs, of course, are language, are words. So the words that we use in whatever language we might be communicating in at the moment. Right now I'm speaking with you in English. And we're using words that register in our ears and with our brains as a pattern of sounds to refer to something beyond the word itself, the pattern of sounds we're hearing itself. And there's always going to be a difference between the sign and the thing signified. And in most of the time, the sign itself is going to be arbitrary. We could use anything to be the sign. It just so happens I'm speaking English because we have an English language that has historically developed out of other languages over hundreds of years. Previously, before that, over thousands of years from other languages that developed. And culturally, this particular language has become the one in which we are speaking in this course. But you and I don't really have much control over that, and that doesn't really have anything to do inherently with the concepts themselves, with the things that are being referred to themselves. So here's an example. Let's say I use the word run. Now, if you think about that for a moment, what does the English word run signify? Run is the sign. The letters R-U-N, the pronunciation run, it's registering in your ears, it's registering in your brain. What does it signify to you? Well, it could signify a number of things because this particular sign, run, in English, has at least several different senses of meaning. So we could, in one instance, say it refers to physically running. Someone runs. We could say it refers to running for office. Someone runs for office. And in that sense, we're actually using the notion of running physically as a kind of metaphor for running in a race and for office. You might say that my automobile, my car, is running well. My car runs. So those are at least three different senses, and we probably could think of some more if we wanted to. And if you notice, all of these senses are a related set of concepts in our minds, but the word run, the letters R-U-N, don't bear any inherent relationship to those concepts. And in fact, we could use a different word in a different language and include even different characters, different letters. So I have the Arabic word that in English we would translate run here, and we could do that with other languages as well. All this is simply to illustrate there's a difference between the sign and the signified. Now the fact that there is a difference between the sign and the signified and that the sign is essentially arbitrary is part of what makes modern digital computers work. Because a digital computer is reading language, source code, that is simply sets of zeros and ones. And the digital circuits are interpreting the 0 as being off, in the off position, and the 1 as being in the on position. It's a binary circuit. It's either on or it's off. And by stringing together zeros and ones, you can take instructions that we have in our minds, concepts, actions that we as humans have in our mind, and we can make the machine, the computer, do something with those. And we can also take our verbal signs and translate those into zeros and ones that allow a computer to do something with that information and then to retranslate it back into the kinds of letters that we're familiar with to allow us as humans, again, to read the sign. So the arbitrariness of the sign means that could be the letters RUN or it could be just zeros and ones. And that is a basic important principle for communicating over digital computers. It also means that we can start to talk about, in some depth, concepts of compression. So let's take a message using the sign, I am Professor David Opterbeck, or the sequence of signs, I am Professor David Opterbeck. So that's a linguistic sequence, and as you're hearing it, you know as someone who understands English what it means. I'm telling you my identity in terms of the name that I go by. Now, if we were to convert this into the zeros and ones that a computer can read, we have 30 bytes of information on a computer. One character in ASCII, the code that many computers are going to use to convert letters into verbal concepts, letters into computer readable zeros and ones, is 1 byte. And we've got 30 bytes of information there, and let's say I want to communicate that message to you. And in fact, I'm doing that right now. As I'm speaking with you over this video, I'm encoding this video onto a digital camera. The video is being put together, and I'm going to upload it to a video hosting site, and then you're going to watch it. So I want to communicate this message, I am David Opterbeck, to you. And 30 bytes is not a large amount of bandwidth, but let's just stay with it for a moment. Let's say that I want the message that I'm communicating to not use up all of that bandwidth, because I'm communicating to you in some kind of format that has to be transmitted to you. It's being transmitted to you, in this case, over the internet after being hosted on servers at YouTube or another video hosting site. And the amount of that bandwidth, the amount of hosting space that's available, the amount of space that's available for it to travel to you and get into your computer is not unlimited. And the more bandwidth I'm using up, the more bytes of information I'm trying to transmit, the more problems I'm going to have with getting it to you speedily and intact and on time. So one of the goals and one of the basic principles that allows network communication, that allows all kinds of electronic communication, is that we're taking information that has a certain size, in digital terms, a certain number of bytes, and we want to reduce it to a smaller size, to a smaller number of bytes, so that it flows more freely over the system, and then to have a capacity so that it can be expanded into the full number of bytes that it has, so that the entirety of the content of the message can be received by the receiver. So think of it this way: transmitter, the full size of the message; compression, taking the full size of the message and reducing that size; and then decompression, taking the reduced thing and putting it back into its full size. And the way that that's done is through algorithms. So an algorithm is simply a set of rules for completing a process. And the algorithms that originally allowed for the compression and then decompression of messages with minimal loss to the content, and we call that lossiness, minimal loss to what is decompressed so that the receiver can hear it, is an important technological piece of what underlies digital communications and the internet today, and it's called information theory. So what we want to do is we want to have an algorithm that takes the information on this side, that applies a set of rules and allows us to reduce the size of that content so it flows more quickly and more freely. And then we want to apply those same rules in reverse so that the information can be properly expanded. So take this message, I am David Opterbeck, and let's say that our algorithm is this. The word I equals I am. The letter P equals professor, and the letter DO equals David Opterbeck. That's an algorithm. And if we do that, then I can transmit the message, I am Professor David Opterbeck. Our algorithm can reduce that to IPDO. So we've compressed that, and then at the other end, if we apply the algorithm, it can expand back again into I am Professor David Opterbeck. So notice that we've taken 30 bytes of information, I am David Opterbeck. We've compressed it to 4 bytes, a much smaller size. And then we have expanded it back into 30 bytes again. And we don't have any loss in the simple way of applying this. Now, this sounds great. I mean, this is a terrible algorithm if the possible set of messages we might want to convey is much bigger than just I am David Opterbeck. Because what if someone wants to say, I am Professor Donald Olson? Well, it still could be IPDO, but now you need a different algorithm. So it's not easy to come up with a convenient, workable algorithm that applies to human information and signs of the kind that are human speech, human language, and that can do this effectively with minimal loss. But technologists did it. One of the pioneers in this was Claude Shannon. And over the decades, technologists have did this. And this underlies all the technology that we're using now. As I've made this video, this is many megabytes of information. It's a lot of information. And in order to be able to host it on YouTube and to have that streamed over internet pipes, broadband pipes, so that you can watch it, it has to be compressed. And there are codecs algorithms that allow all of that to happen, that allow all of our discussion on the internet to happen. If all we had was compression, that would be good, but we wouldn't yet have the internet. And we could be sending that information over circuits that have to connect to each other. And that is the way a lot of telecommunications was done before the advent of packet switching, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Now, circuit switching can work, but we could literally have, I have a wire that's connected to my device. We have a box that does and that wire connects to a box. And then there's a wire physically that connects it to your box, and the wire from that box connects to your receiver, and that could allow us to communicate. Now, obviously that gets quite a bit more complex, even if you have something like a relatively small telephone network. And that's where you see these old-fashioned boards of connections, circuit boards, between telephones, and where the operator has to take the call and take a plug and put that plug into the right slot, and then through various connections like that, there's going to be a physical circuit between me and you if we're using that old-fashioned kind of telephone network. Now, the downside to that, of course, is as the size of the network grows, you need bigger and bigger and bigger and more unwieldy circuit connection points. And it ends up getting so large that it's unmanageable. So I have a short video here that I'm going to integrate, and there's also a link to it in the notes that will show you what an old-fashioned circuit switched network looks like. So we're going to watch this for a moment, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about packet switching and how packet switching made the internet possible.
So here we are, just one small section of the switchboard from Enfield Telephone Exchange, as it was in the manual era. It's going on show in the Science Museum to represent Enfield in 1960.
I'm one of a team of actors who work at the Science Museum. I've been asked to prepare the role of a telephonist from Enfield Exchange in 1960. So I've been developing the character based on research. So these are 3 positions then for 3 operators to sit at. You have to keep your elbows to yourself, don't you? Otherwise
That's
you
right.
won't be popular. So if I was the operator at this board, those would be my subscribers, so I'd be speaking to them possibly quite regularly.
Well, regular callers, of course, would get to know the voices of the operators. The manual switchboard meant that it had this human feel about it. Of course, the supervisors were really quite strict. They wanted to make sure that their girls were sort of behaving decorously and properly in the switch room.
I've heard some stories saying where you can't say loo or lavatory, so they would actually put their hand up and ask for an urgent. That's right, isn't it?
I think that's right. I was trying to think what the word is. Yes, it's an urgent.
There's not only the etiquette, is there? There's the elocution and how the ladies...
Oh, yes, you were trained. There was a process. You couldn't engage in conversation. The operators, working so close together, they generally built up quite a bit of teamwork. So you could imagine when the time came to convert Enfield away from manual to automatic, it must have been a bit traumatic.
Absolutely. It's the people that you're working with and that interaction.
It was at a time when people tended to stay in a job, and so it mattered a lot more to them that something rather special was breaking up. So the time came in October 1960, the calls gradually died away and all the plugs were cleared, and they said, all clear. Within a minute or two, the switchboard, which had been alive, was now dead. A few moments later, they cut in the new auto. And at that time, all the switchboard operators pushed back their chairs, came out into the middle of the room, and joined hands, and they all sang Auld Lang Syne.
It's a very emotional, very dramatic sort of story, isn't it?
Yes. But what it shows is that people cared. As some of them said, behind each of these jacks is a human being.
Okay, so as we saw, circuit switching works. It quickly can become big and unwieldy. With analog transmissions, circuit switching might be the only feasible way to do it, because we then really have an electronic and electric signal, and it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to figure out how to break up pieces of that electric signal and spread them around. But with digital communications, we have something different, because what we have now is the sign, my verbal sign, is being encoded in the signs that a digital computer reads, which are just zeros and ones. And we can apply our compression algorithm. So I've got certain number of zeros and ones, a certain number of bytes. In the original message, we compress it to a smaller number of bytes. We could just send that directly, but what we can also do is break up that message into shorter segments. And we can send each individual segment over different routes across the network. And that allows us to have a network that is much more flexible and much more dispersed. When I'm relying on a circuit switch network, we have to have a circuit, one circuit between me and you that is functioning. Now there's a lot that can happen. That circuit can just fail for mechanical reasons. A tree could fall on the wires. In a military scenario, that circuit could be split by being cut by being blown up with a bomb. And in fact, during the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, the military was worried that if we have even large circuit switch networks through which the military is communicating with each other, and there's an atomic bomb that destroys a part of a city or a part of the country, it's going to be really, really hard to rebuild those circuits. It might be a long time before parts of the country have any ability at all to communicate with each other. So for a number of reasons of efficiency and resiliency, robustness of the network, the ability to take the message and break it into individual packets and send those packets around through different routes is really appealing. Now, if I have a particular circuit, a particular route, piece of the network that is disabled, it's broken, it was, sabotaged, whatever it might be, a packet can't go over that one, but the packet can find another way around. Now, if you combine this with technology, routing technology, that at any given moment allows different packets of information to try to find the most efficient route, now you're going to begin to significantly increase the speed of transmission of all of those packets. And then what you need at the end, so you need at the front end some technology that's going to allow the different packets of information to be split up. And then likewise, you're going to need some technology at the receiving end that allows those packets to be put back together to be reassembled into the whole message. So if you think about this, there's a message, there's technology that allows the message to be translated into the zeros and ones of a digital computer. There's a technology that allows, with algorithms, all those zeros and ones to be compressed into a smaller number of zeros and ones. There's a technology that allows that string of zeros and ones to be broken into packets. There's a technology that helps route each of those packets through different parts of the network. And then relatedly, the technology allows the packets to be reassembled, decompressed, and read. The technology for this is essentially computer code. We're dealing here with zeros and ones. It's not, there's physical, circuits that make it work, physical boxes and wires that make it work. But what we're really talking about is computer code. And this is the genius, really, of the internet, that there are common protocols, common computer code that allows for the compression and decompression and for the breaking into packets and putting the packets back together of information that transfers over the internet. And we're going to talk in a minute about the development of some of those protocols and how some of them matter for internet law and governance. But I want to show you another brief video to give you a more of a visual understanding of packet switching and how packet switching works.
In this video, we look at packet switching as a method of routing packets on a wide area network. Packet switching is not the only method of transferring data on a wide area network, but it certainly is quite efficient. It's more secure than other methods. TCP splits data into multiple packets and IP routes the individual packets in different directions, depending on the bandwidth available and the best route to take. TCP checks the transmission between 2 points was successful and sequences the packets back into the correct order when they reach their destination. Let's have a look at how this works. So for the purposes of this illustration, we'll assume we've got a red packet, a green packet, and a purple packet, and they're all part of the same message that's being communicated to a server. So the red packet is transmitted to the router and to the internet service provider, the green packet is transferred to the router and internet service provider, and the purple packet is transferred to the router and internet service provider. Now at this point, the packets can take different routes to get to the destination. So the red packet might take one route, the green packet takes a different route, and the purple packet too. The route that it takes is decided by the IP protocol, and this will depend on the bandwidth available and the best route to get to the destination, if the destination is known at all. If the destination is not known, then the packet simply is transferred to the next router. So here we can see the red packets, the green packets and the purple packets are taking their own individual routes across the wide area network. Eventually they're going to reach the server. And when they do, the TCP protocol is going to resequence the packets back into the correct order. The protocol information can then be stripped away, and what you get left with is the data that the server can use. This is how data is communicated on a wide area network, and indeed it's how the internet itself actually works.
So now you have a feel for the concept of sign and signified, for the concept of compression, for the concept of packet switching. And you know that the ability to transfer an analog, a spoken or written message in human language into digital code, compress, break up the packets, reassemble the packets is really important. And here's some of the history of how this develops in the history of the internet. And if you look at these dates, you'll notice that they relate to the beginnings of the modern computer era, which really begins in the 1940s, 1950s. And they also relate, not coincidentally, to the Cold War era, when the United States and the Soviet Union are locked in this technological struggle, and there's security concerns and there's concerns about even the possibility of nuclear war. And it is out of all this, building of the communications networks, the beginnings of modern computing, the race of the Cold War, that a lot of thought and innovation begins and starts the early development of the internet. So we're going to go through some of this history selectively and really quickly, but I do want you to have a feel of some key figures and some key concepts. So in 1961, you have a paper by Kleinrock on the idea of packet switching. In 1962, you have J.C. Licklider working at DARPA, which is part of the Defense Department, on the idea of a galactic network, sort of conceptually the idea of the internet. 1968, the creation of the ARPANET, which is created within the US government. 1972, the first demonstration of the possibility of email over the ARPANET, and Kahn develops the concept of open architecture networking or interneting. The idea that the protocols that we talked about, those code protocols, would be common, so that regardless of the hardware you're using, regardless of where you're starting and where you're ending, the compression and decompression and the disassembly and reassembly would all work together. Now I know for many of you, it's difficult to conceive of this period of history in sort of computer time. It's a little bit difficult for me. I was just a little child at this time. So I didn't know much of what was going on, but I do certainly remember, growing up in the 1970s and getting into the 1980s, and nobody has a personal computer in their house. Nobody has a laptop. There's no such thing as cell phones. The notion that we would have a device like a cell phone that we would carry in our pockets that would allow us to connect directly to each other through text or voice messages, that would allow us to access a global network of information at our fingertips and watch videos on demand and listen to music, it was science fiction. It didn't exist at the time, and it was just the beginnings of all of that happening here in the 60s and 70s, and that shows you part of the brilliance of some of the people who worked on this in these early years. Now, Kahn has this idea of open architecture networking, and I want to show you here some principles in work that Kahn published at this time about open architecture networks. And one thing I want you to take away from this is that these principles really remain the foundation of how today we think about the open internet and internet governance. Or I should say, they form the foundation of how we have thought about the open internet and internet governance since the dawn of the public internet era in the mid-1990s. And that is an era that I personally remember. I was the first lawyer in New Jersey to have a homepage on the internet, believe it or not, when I was a young lawyer in 1994. So I remember those early days. And these norms, these ideas have informed the way many in the internet community have thought of what the internet ought to be. One thing we're going to be asking throughout this class in terms of law and governance and cybercrime is whether these norms really still apply, whether they should still apply, in what way law and governance and the problem of cybercrime has to impinge on these norms or not. So, first principle for Kahn's idea: each network stands on its own and does not require any internal change to connect to the internet. So I'm talking to you here from a little video studio I have in my home office. I'm going to edit this video on my home computer. I'm going to then upload it from my home computer network to YouTube, and it's going to be on servers hosted by Google at that point and another network, and then I'm going to link that to our course page at NYU, so it's going to be connected to the NYU network, and then you're going to be accessing it maybe while you're on campus at NYU, or more likely, I suspect, from your home or from another place of work. So there's at least, at a minimum, 4 or 5 separate networks that are being connected to each other, inter-networked, so that we can do this video class. And the notion that Kahn has is, he says those separate networks, they can be configured however the administrator, the owner of those networks, wants them to be. They can use whatever equipment the owner wants that to use. They can internally use whatever protocols and have whatever features, including security features, that the owner of those networks want to have. And the internet doesn't change that. What the internet is the connections between those discrete networks, the inter part. And that's where the protocols are in common. So this allows for a lot of flexibility. It lets a network, it lets the internet grow without imposing too much top-down, and it lets innovation in the way individual networks are structured and the equipment they use differ. It lets those things develop on their own while allowing them to connect together. Communications are on a best efforts basis. Undelivered packets are retransmitted from the source. So this is one of the pieces of genius that goes with packet switching. So you could have a lot of pieces of communication if the network of networks, the internet, starts to scale, starts to grow. You have a lot of different packets floating around. And this principle says that those packets get delivered all equally. The network does the best it can technologically to find a route through which each packet gets through. And related to that, the connections, the gateways, the routers, the things that move the packets around are black boxes. They don't retain information about the packets that flow through them. Now you're going to see, when we come back to it a little later in the semester, the idea of network neutrality, the principles of the idea of network neutrality are embedded here in these early principles of open network design put forth by Kahn. The network, the inter-network, doesn't discriminate between packets, doesn't prioritize packets. It's simply a technological feature, how packets get across. And the final one from Kahn here is that there's no global control at the operations level. So what does that mean? In a local network, the NYU network, my home network, you have an administrator who controls the network. Now, in the case of my or your home network, most of us probably aren't professional network administrators. But nevertheless, I know that there's any number of computers and devices in my home, and I determine which ones are on or which ones are off, which ones are receiving data, which ones are not. And at a larger scale, same is true with the NYU network. There are administrators whose job it is to monitor and decide what's connected and what's not. In the internet, the internetwork, the connections between networks, Kahn's idea is that doesn't happen. It is a technologically enabled feature that no one controls. And that means and it's related to this principle of network neutrality, there's no central authority saying those packets get through, those packets don't. That's all a technological function. So we'll see when we come back in the semester and as we start to really dig into civil liberties on the internet. We'll see the ways in which these principles inform the technology of the internet and the ethos of the internet, but we'll also see ways in which those principles are mitigated or restricted by law and by public policy. And we might decide together that in some cases that's necessary, maybe violent crime or child pornography, but we might decide in many cases it's overly restrictive. And that's part of what we'll be discussing and debating throughout the whole semester. So in 1973 then, Robert Kahn and Vint Cerf developed the TCP/IP protocol. And this is really the main original protocol that allows the internet to function, the technological protocol, the code that allows the networks to connect into a network of networks. And in that same year, the domain name system is invented. And we're going to be talking more about the domain name system in the coming weeks. It's in the early to mid-1980s that the TCP/IP protocol begins to be adopted widely in the United States. There is not yet in the United States at this point a public internet. The internet is mostly confined to academic institutions, government and military, and to some corporate entities, but it isn't really public yet. It's in the early to mid-1990s, with support from the US government and from US government policy, that the public internet and private internet networks joining the public internet begins to become a reality. And as I mentioned, I remember this period as a young lawyer. I started practicing in 1991, and I was the first lawyer, according to the New Jersey Law Journal, to have a homepage on the internet. And it was really just for me at that point a hobby. I was interested in how the law might relate to this new technology, and I did a little bit of HTML and wrote this little text-based page. And at the time, if you look back at that article from the time, it says that there are a couple of hundred law firms around the world searchable on Yahoo. Google didn't exist yet. And that there were, I think it said 40 million individual people connected to the internet. Now think about that, because today pretty much every law firm around the world has some kind of presence on the internet. Every law firm of any size certainly has a web page. And about 4 billion people around the world are connected to the internet. Now 4 billion is still maybe a little over half the world's population. There are a lot of people in the world who still don't have access, but think of the phenomenal growth of that. And then in 1996, the Clinton administration passes the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1996. And the Telecommunications Reform Act has some specific provisions that we're going to look at a little later in the semester, and in particular, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which you may have heard of in the news, and we're going to get into that in some depth. But the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1996 also sets the U.S. policy to say that the internet is not going to be regulated in the same way as television, as radio, as cable television, all of which were fairly heavily regulated and had requirements about what stations could carry and how many stations there could be, and a lot of that related to the earlier days of those technologies when they were fully analog and you could have interference in the airwaves between different signals. And the internet being fully into the digital era and being a different policy on purpose, the idea was that it would not be regulated in the same way as some of these other networks. So I'm going to show you a brief video clip of the signing ceremony of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 so you can get a feel of what it was like at that time, at the very birth of kind of the public birth of the internet and when it first starts to become more widely available to everyone, and what the thinking was and the mood was, at least among US policymakers, about the steps they were taking in relation to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of Congress, and ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking the Library of Congress for hosting us here. At my understanding, this may be the only time in American history a piece of legislation has been signed here, and perhaps the first time in 3 decades when one has been signed on Capitol Hill. If that is so, then this is certainly a worthy occasion. I thank Lily Tomlin for reminding us that the internet can be fun. And the students at Calvin Coolidge for reminding us that the internet can do a world of good. I thank the Vice President who fought for this bill for so long on behalf of the American people. And I thank the members of Congress in both parties, starting with the leadership, who believed in the promise and the possibility of telecommunications reform. I thank the vast array of interest groups who had sometimes conflicting concerns about this bill, who were able to work together and work through them so that we could move this together. This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep. In the State of the Union just a few days ago, I asked the Congress to pass this law, and they did with remarkable speed and dispatch. Even the years that were spent working on it were a relatively short time, given the tradition of congressional decision-making over major matters. This historic legislation, in my way of thinking, really embodies what we ought to be about as a country and what we ought to be about in this city. It clearly enables the age of possibility in America to expand, to include more Americans. It will create many, many high-wage jobs. It will provide for more information and more entertainment to virtually every American home. It embodies our best values by supporting the kind of market reforms that the Vice President mentioned, as well as the V-chip. And it brings us together, and it was passed by people coming together. This bill is an indication of what can be done when Republicans and Democrats work together in a spirit of genuine cooperation to advance the public interest and bring us to a brighter future.
Now I want to turn to Barlow's Declaration of Independence for cyberspace. And the first thing I want you to note about it is that he is writing in response to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So this statute that the US policymakers are thinking is establishing a framework for an open, publicly available internet. Some people, such as Barlow, interpreted as an effort by the US government to exert control over the internet. And that's an interesting thing to think about as we evaluate Barlow's declaration. And so where Barlow says in the United States they've created a law, the Telecommunications Reform Act, and this is the Act of 1996, which he says repudiates your Constitution, insults the dreams of Jefferson, Madison, Mill, de Tocqueville, and Brandeis. Obviously some quite heated rhetoric here from Barlow. And Barlow, by the way, was a very interesting character. He and part of his life was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He had these sort of very strong libertarian sensibilities and became famous also for this declaration and for the work on what he perceived to be the independence of the internet. And so you see some of Barlow's language as you've read the declaration of talking about cyberspace doesn't lie within anyone's borders, that there is no moral right to rule within cyberspace, that our identities in cyberspace are distributed, and that the ordinary processes of governance and law don't apply in cyberspace. Now, this term, cyberspace, where does this term come from? And many people attribute the term to a science fiction novelist, William Gibson, who wrote a novel called Neuromancer. And Gibson's conception was that there would be a computer network that individuals could plug themselves, their brains directly into, and then their sort of consciousness, their perception would be in this space that today we would call virtual reality. And that would be cyberspace. And so this concept of the internet as an alternate place, a kind of virtual reality, even though VR technology wasn't really very much available at that time, caught on. And so you can see how someone like Barlow took it. Now, I call this internet exceptionalism, and this is the first kind of wave, I think, of political and social and then even legal theorizing about what the internet is and how the internet ought to be governed. And some legal scholars, such as David Post, took up really the kind of theme that Barlow was raising. And I asked you to read an excerpt from one of Post's articles, and notice how Post says that the rise of cyberspace, the rise of the internet, severs the traditional links, the historic links between local governmental power and local governmental territory and law and governance. And for Post, this meant that the internet was going to really revolutionize how we think about law and governance, that the way we've thought of law and governance way back in history, and then in particular in the modern period since the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century, after the 30 Years' War, when we think of nation states that have the right and the ability to have their own sovereign laws within the bounds of their territory, that may differ from the sovereign laws of other nation states, and then then there's international law that is kind of the interface between the different nation states with their own sovereign laws, but it has to do with territory and culture and history. And Post says that notion of territory, culture, history is really exploded by cyberspace. That's a kind of cyber exceptionalism. Then there was a reaction in the legal scholarship, at least, to these ideas of internet exceptionalism and into a kind of form of internet non-exceptionalism. And I gave you an excerpt from the article by Frank Easterbrook, who is a federal appellate judge and was a law professor, and is well known for his concepts of the way law relates to neoclassical economics. And so he's writing very much in the vein, actually, of saying, no, our basic mechanisms of governance haven't really changed. And that's why he calls this cyberspace and the law of the horse. So at one point he says the horse was a new technology, so to speak. It was new to humans, and it seemed really radical and transformative at the time, many, many millennia ago, and it was. But with every development like this, concepts of private property rights, concepts of contract law, concepts of torts, the law of injury when something goes wrong, these same kinds of concepts apply. But we really don't have to radically change those concepts. We just have to look in some detail about how they relate to whatever the new technology is. And he said the same thing is true of the internet. This idea that cyberspace is unique and ungovernable and explodes our previous notions of the rule of law, Easterbrook said, is really nonsense. And what we should focus on is, well, how can we refine, kind of tweak and refine our ideas about contracts, about making bargains, about property rights, so that they apply clearly in cyberspace. That's Easterbrook's idea. Then I think there's a third kind of bucket, if I say cyber exceptionalists, cyber non-exceptionalists, and then there was a wave of scholarship that wasn't exceptionalist, but also wasn't non-exceptionalist. It was, I wouldn't quite say somewhere in the middle, but it was moderating these ideas through a phrase that became very popular, which is the idea that the code is the law. Code is law. And one of the themes behind this is to think about how a communications network works. And this is a reason that we have spent a lot of time in this lecture talking about the development of the internet and the way the internet works, because it relates directly to this idea of code is law. So we can actually have a much more complex model, or somewhat more complex model, of how a communication systems works. But we can simplify it to say there are three basic layers. At the bottom, there's the hardware layer. There are cables and routers and wires and computer keyboards and terminals and screens. Physical hardware. At the very top of it, there's the content layer. This is the information that we're communicating to each other. This is what is signified by the signs, right? The ideas, the concepts, the ideas in my video that I'm getting across to you, that's the content layer. And then sitting in between that is the code layer. The code layer are these protocols that allow the hardware to send the content and to receive and decompress the content. So the DNS system, the TCP/IP protocol is part of the code layer. And so we can think of legal aspects that relate to these different layers of the communication system. For the hardware layer, we have traditional things that Easterbrook was talking about: property rights, contract rights, utilities regulation, zoning, and the like. For the content layer, we have some of the big themes of civil liberties that you might think about and that we will talk about throughout this class: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, censorship, educational policy, things that relate to how the law that relates to how we communicate. And both of those are traditional areas of law. At the code layer, it's a bit different. There's intellectual property, perhaps copyright, maybe some degree of patent, that can apply to the code layer. But a lot of it is intentionally kept open source, and governed in an open way. And for figures that were interested in this code as law paradigm, the idea was that this is the way it ought to be. We ought to really focus on keeping that code layer essentially ungoverned and open, while we recognize there has to be governance around content, especially if we're interested in freedom of speech, and there has to be governance around the hardware layer because that is property rights. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do in our discussion board for this week is to consider which of these different paradigms do you think makes more sense? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the internet exceptionalist view, of the internet non-exceptionalist view, and of the sort of mediating code as law view? And I think as we discuss this beginning this week, we'll see how some of these themes relate to the more direct legal themes that we talk about throughout the semester. So I hope you enjoyed this first video lecture and got a feel for the way the internet works and how it developed and why some of the norms of open networking are as they are within the development of the internet, and how some of those concepts relate to different models of the way law and governance might relate to cyberspace. And I'll see you in person in class next week.